Welcome to the Global Hydrogen interview series, where we ask what is next for what could be the new oil of the 21st century, or at the very least, extremely influential in the world's evolving and low carbon energy basket. My name is 𝗚𝗂𝗍𝗀. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence, and I'm very glad to say that Charlie Rattan is with us. He is a hydrogen business advisor and a member of the faculty at the World Hydrogen Leaders. Hi, Charlie.
Hi again, Michelle.
How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. It's been a very lively year since we last spoke, hasn't it?
It certainly has. We're going to try and squeeze as many of those developments as possible into the next 15 minutes, so we can wish ourselves luck. I'll just give a quick overview of where we're standing with the hydrogen momentum at the moment, just in case anybody's missed the headlines and been living under a rock for the last 8-9 months especially. So already we've got countries representing nearly 90% of global GDP have policies or initiatives that support hydrogen markets. That's 90%, and there are now 359 large-scale hydrogen projects worldwide, and this is very, very interesting, 36% of which have been announced since February this year. I think that's the most interesting point of those 359 large-scale hydrogen projects. And we've got around $500 billion of global investments in projects and values anticipated up to 2030, so over the next 9 years. So now the real question for oil and gas stakeholders in the Middle East is, how can we get more of this rather fast-growing pie? Now, progress has certainly been made, and Charlie, I know you're going to take us through some of that and open our eyes to more areas as well, because we're seeing NOCs in the Middle East trying to leverage their strong position already. So we've got the UAE recently inaugurated its first industrial scale green hydrogen project in MENA. Oman's planning to build a 25 gigawatt green hydrogen plant. Russia's announced it wants to work with Saudi Arabia. Germany said it wants to work with Saudi Arabia. India and the UAE are having talks. So it's not just on a regional basis, but also trying to leverage those global and historical energy ties to really broaden that hydrogen network. From your perspective, Charlie, how do you think the Middle East is progressing, the oil and gas side of the Middle East and in the Middle East is progressing when it comes to hydrogen knowledge and hydrogen alliances?
Yeah, it's been a remarkable year since we last spoke, Michelle, and I think that the evidence of the progress is phenomenal in the 12 months. And I think actually they're extremely well placed. If you look at, you mentioned Oman at the top there, and that 26, I think, gigawatt, that is not a demonstrator project. That is a vast industrial scale, and they've gone that almost from a standing start. So that is a remarkable statement of intent. So if you were to take that country, for example, you might say, well, it's relatively mature. In the oil and gas world, it's got infrastructure, so it will have ports, some of which I think the port of Rotterdam, another world leader, is well placed to get involved with. You've got perhaps pipelines, you've got reservoirs that might be ready for, perhaps if there was to be a carbon capture and storage element of it, or for some compression element. So the infrastructure, I think it would need tweaking rather than starting again. So you might want to start an assessment, say, well, when were the pipelines built? When were the refineries built? What do we do at the refineries? Are we going to pivot them? Are we looking at biofuels? Are we looking at ammonia? Are we looking at hydrogen? Can we tie it into industrialization and our wider aspirations? Perhaps we want a manufacturing base here. Perhaps we could manufacture a plant, diggers, with trucks, vehicles, transport. Perhaps we could go into fuel cell productions. All of that needs a lot of energy, and all of that, if you're going to decarbonize, and you might find hydrogen in its various forms, is an extremely useful mechanism. I suppose the Middle East is looking at its resource now, which is perhaps looking away from traditional fossils to renewables. You look at the solar resource, you look at the wind resource, you might look at offshore as well, and combine them and say, if you really want to drive the cost down, the cost is actually in the feedstock, the energy. And so if you've got abundant resource, and some of the solar rounds have been absolutely eye-poppingly ambitious in how the price—
World record lows, yes.
Yes, yeah. And feed that into a business case, then you've got a world-class opportunity. And I think people in the last 12 months, certainly from the calls I'm receiving, are well aware of that opportunity. A couple of nuances, and I think this is where the UK might be in an advantageous position regarding the Middle East, is that we have an oil and gas industry here. Some of the continental countries, Germany, might come more from an electrical background, they might already be on the ground there. But we're familiar with the nuances of engineering, of pipelines, of health and safety, of logistics, all the things that you need to make a successful transition from perhaps fossil to renewables, and that certainly includes the wider hydrogen economy, and I would certainly include ammonia, I would say possibly e-methanol, all the things that refineries do, and of course hydrogen itself in its different guises. So I think the Middle East as a region is supremely well placed, Michelle.
And how does the confidence factor into that? Are oil and gas stakeholders and companies in the region, are they confident that yes, we do want to make this pivot? Is it still for them a case of we want to have a separate arm that deals with this side of things, or is it more appetite for we want to integrate this into our trunk essentially? We want
that's a truly excellent question. I suppose if you look at economics, confidence underpins everything from currency, which you might say is arguably petrodollars in certain major currencies, to the confidence on the ground. You might argue that it's perhaps been led by the European oil and gas majors and utilities, and I'm thinking of your Shells, your BPs, Eni's, Totals, but close behind, of course, those countries are in the Middle East as well, and close behind, I think Middle Eastern interests are there. Behind those, you might look towards the United States and say, well, look, the old Standard Oil clutch, your Exxons and your Chevrons are perhaps a little bit slower to this new energy transition mindset, but there are political developments there too. So I would say, yeah, perhaps they're not in the first tranche, but certainly following on very, very quickly and getting up to speed very quickly. I'm sure the interest that you've tracked and mentioned in your outset shows that there is confidence. It's just a case of how to make it work and how to make it work in a smart way, how to make it perhaps work in a circular way, how to make it work for the country where prosperity. It's not easy for a country to think, well, I've got hundreds of years of fossil resources here, but is that really the future for us? And we might have thought it was, even until relatively recently. So it's a big pivot. But I think the confidence, obviously, it will be augmented when some of these major projects come off the drawing board and into production, because it's never as easy as perhaps the policy people think. Here's 26 gigawatts of the intercontinental scheme in Oman you mentioned, but that's still not built out. So
I mean, pen and paper is far easier than anything that's tangible. That's certainly true. And you just mentioned there about how, in a best case scenario, how to make these sorts of plans part of a circular economy, adopting circular principles going forward. And I would argue that suggest that that's quite a way away still. It's towards the end of the decade, 2030s, even for that sort of ambition. But on a more near-term basis, how confident or how do you see oil and gas companies, obviously for some nations in the Middle East, the beating heart of the economy, integrating their hydrogen plans or aligning their hydrogen plans alongside national investments goals, existing climate plans as well, talent development. A lot of these countries have national visions. How can hydrogen fit into that?
I think you'd probably go for the low-hanging fruit there, Michelle, to make it happen. You might say, well, some of the assets are already towards the end of the lifetime. You probably might look at the refineries and say, well, what about our product lines for what? You might say, well, rather what's happening here at Stanlow, say, well, let's allocate a part of the refinery for the future, and perhaps then see, well, if so, which part? Are we going to look at ammonia? Are we going to look at some other e-fuels, or so even some biofuels, and say, well, let's try it. Let's try and see whether it works. So it doesn't have to be a massive 100% commitment overnight, but you might say, well, what's already is that reservoir nearing being spent, and then if so, could we use it? Could we use it for storage of hydrogen? Could we use it for some carbon capture and storage, which is aligned to it? And then you might start to come out with real projects on the back of that, and that might involve partnerships. It might involve Middle Eastern governments reaching out to existing the oil and gas majors are already there. They're already committed to net zero, so you might have that chat, and then obviously, like anywhere else, you go through the planning and then the implementation.
I'm glad you just touched on partnerships there, because just to talk about the EU, which obviously is almost on its own race when it comes to hydrogen, it's making so much progress. But they seek to tap into the Clean Hydrogen Partnership and an innovation fund of up to $36 billion and various other instruments and goals, 40,000 kilometers of hydrogen-ready pipelines by 2040, and so on, and wanting to pass the 1 million ton mark every year for green hydrogen. So these are significant goals. The Middle East obviously has historical trade routes with the EU. There've already been conversations between EU countries, notably Germany, with the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, especially in terms of how can we work together? Can we discuss perhaps having imports and so on? How do you see oil and gas companies leveraging this opportunity with the EU and perhaps India and other major trade ties they have?
Yeah, well, my former company, Shell, is obviously European based. They've got excellent connections in throughout the Middle East. They're already there. They're already probably talking to the people in the ministries and on the ground, and then start to think, well, what is our asset base? How can we pivot it to the new? With the Shell and people like that have already committed to net zero by 2050. So, and that's not far off in major project terms, 28, 29 years from our discussion today. And that's on a global basis. So then the challenge, I suppose, is then how to make it work in the Middle East, and then to perhaps take a high kind of back step and say, well, let's have a look at our asset base in the Middle East. Let's see what refineries, what pipeline networks, what other infrastructure we've got.
As you mentioned with Oman.
Yeah, exactly. I think Oman is the absolute front leader, but there are other places. He's certainly looking at places like Project NEOM in Saudi Arabia, the developments in Dubai and elsewhere in the region. So you would then marry the asset base perhaps with the resource that you might want to tap into. I've already mentioned the supreme solar resource, wind on and offshore, and hybrid schemes as well. And then reusing, you mentioned the big European aspiration, the pipeline network. A lot of that's reusing existing infrastructure. You don't need a complete new pipeline network. You might say, well, I can refurbish it, make it fit for hydrogen, which has got different characteristics from methane. And how can we do that in a smart way? And then the supply chain. Is that going to be decarbonised as it's made, and perhaps make it future-proof as well? It's already happening in tenders.
Well, an ideal world, absolutely, Charlie. Yes.
It's already happening. Certainly here in the UK, you're looking at major projects. They're looking at net zero alignment. I mean, you're not just going to do it from day one, but rather that fleet of vans. Are they electric? Are they hydrogen? What about the lighting? What about the welfare? So all of that is part of the bigger picture. But the Middle East, I mean, it's got a remarkable resource, hasn't it? I mean, people have started to map the resource. You mentioned Oman, Saudi, and the price every time there's an auction, it plummets. And the feedstock is a major part of the cost for project development. So if you were to look dispassionately as a global investor and say, well, the opportunity is fantastic. You've got existing assets, existing knowledge, you know all about logistics, infrastructure, all about the petrochemical side of things, scary stuff, ammonia, corrosive, horrible. You're familiar with it, so there's no fear of it. And align that perhaps with other national aspirations. What about agriculture? And what about water? What about
water?
Yeah, and all of these, if you think about it at an early stage, and say, well, that's part of a bigger picture. And so hydrogen can be embedded in part of a wider national aspiration. And indeed, that's not just fanciful. That's exactly what's happening.
You just mentioned something there about the UK that I just want to pick up on, and this reply needed to be just about the Middle East. It's more of a broader question. I'm just interested to hear your view on it. And you mentioned about the UK very much in some circles thinking about circular economy in its truest form. You know, where's the wood on the desk going? Where's the battery from my computer going? Where's, you know, in the truest form, where those sorts of conversations in other regions that I have, it's more on a circular principles are being adopted within a much more marginal sense rather than the broad true sense of a circular economy. And it just makes me think about how diverse the national hydrogen strategies for worldwide are coming through. We mentioned just before we signed on that some are essentially a very strong mention of intent. We want to do X, Y, Z, and we are serious, and it's more of a political move to demonstrate that desire. And others are far more detailed. We'll take the EU out the running completely because they're just a different level. Others are far more detailed, huge financing packages and so on. And there is this, as you would expect with a new market, new roadmaps, of course, there is such variety on a global scale. Would you hope to see some kind of overarching establishment or overarching body or something along those lines in the next few years to try and unite some of these key goals?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Uniting those stakeholders. What might work for the UK might not work for South Africa, a developing country in itself with mineral and fossil resources. But I think there's increasingly a move towards the energy intensity of production. If there's to be a guiding light, Also, I think there's a demand pull side to it. I mean, you mentioned the EU. So if you want to export to the EU, you've got far better chance of a project if it's a green one, using renewables, than if it's grey or one of the other colours that's emerging. But if you're not exporting to the EU, if you're exporting to Far East, elsewhere, you might say, well, that's less of an issue. But you certainly see examples in Australia where schemes have started out as blue and have switched to green in mid project because of the export, and say, well, if we are going to export to the EU or Japan or others, then we must be mindful of what the reality is. So I would urge developers to think, where's your market right from the start? Don't just assume your market's just there, hydrogen. Well, which niche is it? So there is an internal debate, the blue, green, grey, black, and that will impact where the economy goes. But it's not always easy. And there are countries that have got aspirations to Western lifestyles, all the rest of it, and think, hey, we've got this resource, let's exploit it, let's train our people. And then suddenly somebody in a room somewhere says, well, actually, that's no longer the future. Sorry. So we'll expect. Yeah.
It's extremely complex on an economic, social, environmental, political. I mean, the complexities are absolutely vast. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, Charlie. Thank you so much. I think we've covered quite a bit, and hopefully we won't leave it a whole year till we catch up again. Because I don't think we'll be able to, because we won't be able to catch up on it in 15 minutes or 15-20 minutes. So thank you very much, Charlie, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks very much indeed, Michelle. Good to talk.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.